to do is take our pitch hitter. Now, I can get away with this because Ambassador Mark Wallace has the dubious distinction not only of having me on his advisory board, but he actually is the board of trustee of my operation. So, when you're in a tight bind, you rely on your friends. Now, I don't think everyone knows Mark as well as I, but even I learn something when I have to introduce my friends and read their bios. And something that I discovered was that the Wall Street Journal compared Ambassador Wallace to Patrick Moynihan and Jean Kilpatrick in his effectiveness in dealing with corruption in the UN, where he served as an ambassador.
That's just to embarrass your board member.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it wouldn't be, it was quite a long bio, by the way. But you see, when you go on and on, there's always something that you...
Somebody did that.
Right. More important, and the reason why I've asked him to come down, and he did come down from New York, is he runs the premier organization, United Against Nuclear Iran, that I think single-handedly has put sanctioning on the policy map. He was doing it before it was cool. And I thought it would be useful from such a partisan, if you will, for that, to hear what he thinks about the question of what we need to do to avoid future reruns.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just I wanted to thank Henry. What he does is so important, and it's a great testament to all of the work that you all do. This is an important and esoteric world. And what being the pitch hitter means is that if a congressman comes in, I'm going to cut my remarks short, which probably means you're lucky. If they don't come in, I'm going to talk a little bit longer. Sorry about that. And that's part of being in that role. I think that Congressman Sherman said something dead on, but I would even make it stronger. I think successive administrations since the time of the fall of the Shah failed, frankly, to deal in an adequate manner with Iran and its nuclear program. And frankly, and this is always scary to say when you're on Capitol Hill, successive Congresses also failed for many years in dealing with the dangers of a nuclear-armed Iran. I think the lesson of the last number of years is that not in all cases, and I'm not just purely a sanctions apologist. I run a group that focuses on economic pressure, which includes sanctions. And I don't really believe they always work in all circumstances, but I think they've had a serious effect in the case of Iran. So depending on the country, it can have a big effect. So I think that the message that Henry had asked me to talk about is that I think the one experience that's different that we can offer, probably more so than anyone else, is we deal with more companies around the world, countries around the world that are dealing with sanctions. We call them out, we deal with them. So we have a very granular level of experience in sort of interacting with people. And I can give you some stories of why I think it's very important that Congress take a much more robust role in this area, the consideration of what you're talking about. And we've actually called for that in the case of Iran. Just in the context of Iran, I think that one of the historical outcomes of whatever happens with Iran will be that the interplay between the administration, whatever you think of the administration, and the interplay between the Congress on Iran, by and large, has been good. And I think that the dynamic of the Congress imposing more sanctions, being involved, has served a very good role. And I think if pressed, I think a lot of the State Department, my friends in the State Department, the Treasury Department would say that is a good role, even as there's been tension. Look, there's been some tension in the hearings. We shouldn't gloss that over. And the tension has risen as we get into the specifics of an agreement. But I want to talk to you guys a little bit about some experiences. No one's paying attention to these issues. And you would think that Iran, as important as it is, as the catalyst of these nuclear issues, would be putting this issue on the map much more. It's not. And it's very disappointing to me because it's what I do. I don't do the nuclear proliferation other than in the context of Henry's board. And I see the struggle of highlighting the Iran issue to the broader population around the country. I'll give you an example. I'm in New York. It's nice to be out of Washington. I used to live in Washington. I love Washington. But you have a bit of a different perspective when you live and work in New York, I think. I don't know if it's good or bad. A very close colleague, his good friend, a very prominent leader of the Jewish community, frankly, in New York, was talking to me, and he's very attuned to these issues. And by any measure, if I named him, you would all say, oh, he's somebody that would know every bit of this issue. Wonderful guy, truly wonderful person. And he said to me last week, Mark, I was sitting next to Henry Kissinger at an event, and he told me that under this interim agreement, Iran could still get a nuclear bomb within a couple months. Is that true? And he said something about breakout capacity. Now, I don't. He's a good friend and a wonderful guy and a very smart guy. But the lack that it would defy every stereotype. This man did not grasp the consequence of the interim agreement and of the nuclear issue in the context of Iran better than this. And it was frankly not good. We've seen it happen before. My wife is a political commentator. I'm a Republican, obviously. But I run a bipartisan shop, and my wife is a commentator. And the lack of discussion about Iran and the nuclear issue in Iran is really shocking. I think it's because of our news cycle and our politics is only able to digest one big issue, and it's almost always a domestic issue, and it's either been the government shutdown of late in healthcare. We looked at some polling data that came out yesterday. Mr. Markey's here, so I'm going to cut short in a minute. We looked at some polling data recently, and in a recent poll, 16% of the country cared about Iran, Syria. If you took it down to just Iran, I think it would be much less. And the result of that is that I think we are very surprised at the lack of informed discourse on both sides of the aisles. And it's also what has been historically a bipartisan issue, particularly in the adoption of sanctions. The most recent polling suggests that while most of the country, most Americans probably are opposed to the interim deal, what's disturbing about it is starting to break on partisan lines a little bit. And just in reading everything out there, Democrats generally support the agreement. Republicans and independents are generally against the agreement. But what's disturbing about it is that I don't know if the Democrats know why they are supporting it always, and I'm not sure why Republicans and independents are opposing it. And we said when we started United Against Nuclear Iran years ago with Ambassador Holbrooke, who was a great friend and a great colleague, Jim Woolsey and others who started our group years ago, that we thought it was very, very important to take an education campaign, frankly what Henry does and what other people in this room do, and educate the American public of really what Iran getting a bomb meant. And we actually proposed it. We never had the funding to do it, frankly. We've always been very thinly funded. But we said we had to really educate the American public and get Congress involved early on. I think we failed horribly on educating the American public. And I think that's one of the experiences that I wanted to convey to you. If we couldn't inform the American public on Iran, I think it's very challenging for this group, whatever side you're on, to inform the American public of the importance of this issue, and I think you have to do that. The only way that we've seen to highlight the issue and inject a broader leadership is to get Congress involved. And we think that's been a great experience, and we think that Congress, in a bipartisan manner, has really spoken loudly on the Iran issue and has been really additive to the debate. So I would say get Congress involved. I will leave you on one last note. In our experience, I don't think we should fear the best people on both sides of the aisle testifying or being involved. You want the best part. We have Republicans, Democrats, people on all sides, and it's amazing when you have the best people, how civil and how reasonable and how narrow the difference is and how good they are. We know that we're doing something right, we think, in our group. We're in New York. I get people, this is my measure. I always get once every 2 months, I get somebody that wants to do a video, showing a nuclear cloud over Washington or New York, blowing up my apartment with a child crying and saying this is the Ayatollah. And I say, and obviously this is on a certain side of the, on the right, saying you have to do this, otherwise you're not doing it right. And then literally we had somebody propose, and I don't want to begrudge either coffee or poetry reading, but somebody said that you had to sponsor, there's poets that want to talk about this in coffee shops in New York. I was like, it's not really for me. I'm a Republican. I don't do poetry. So the lesson of that is that we're trying to get it right, but get the best people. And that's the way that you can elevate the discourse, and we shouldn't fear having it. And the last thing that I will part with is that I think Mitch McConnell, and he was referring to the Tea Party. I don't mean to focus on the Tea Party by any stretch, but groups that really are driven by the policy rather than the entrepreneurial spirit of certain groups are the best, and you shouldn't fear having a discussion about the policy. I say that as I'm like 15 pounds fatter and tired because we've been very thinly funded. But if you have serious bipartisanship issue, so with the smartest people that can elevate the discourse and not be influenced by those that maybe are more agenda-driven on the fringes, I think it will elevate it and help you educate the broader public and get Congress involved, particularly if you don't have the money like me. But anyway, I want to leave that my remarks short because Congressman Markey is here. Thank you all for what you do.
We now are going to bring in the experts. This is different than the people who get election certificates or formal appointments. They're people like me. Why don't the second panel come on up? And what I've asked each to do is to be mercifully brief. And I will enforce this because I think at some point what we'd like to do is get your questions and comments as much as what we want to share with you. I would observe that not everybody is registered in the same political party here, although it's pretty heavy on the Democratic side, I'm thinking.
I don't think you know who I'm registered with, Henry.
I think we know who you voted with. In any case, on that note, why don't we do the following? We will go from right to left, or better yet, from your perspective, the other way around. Chris. Now, do folks need to be introduced at great length? You are the head of the Natural Resource Defense Council's nuclear.
Was until recently.
Was until recently.
Now I'm a senior policy advisor.
He's been promoted. He's now emeritus. But I think anyone who knows the Natural Resource Defense Council knows that they are fairly critical of nuclear power. They did not come out in favor of Mitt Romney's energy program. So we are anchored on the left here. On the other hand, you are an expert, so we want to hear what you have to say.
Well, is this on or on? There we go. I want to echo some of the sentiments of the previous speakers that I worked up here in the 80s and early 90s in the House and Senate. And nuclear non-proliferation was a bipartisan objective in those days. And the alliances often were the principled left and the principled right against the realpolitik center, the tendency of our government, State Department, and industry to pursue opportunistic agreements on a short-term basis and neglect the long-term, as Ed, my former boss, was just saying. And I think even though it's more difficult now, we have to continue to try to view the non-proliferation issue in that way. And so, as far as HR 1280 is concerned, I agree with a lot of the objections that I've read from NEI and Heritage. Jack Spencer's done a very excellent brief on it, on some of the details. But I agree with the overall idea, which is that this is an issue that's too important to leave to the discretion of mid-ranking, and it always is mid-ranking officials that work out these agreements, where the Bureau's view of maintaining the relationship with a country, I'm talking about the country bureau or the regional bureau's view, of maintaining a relationship and good relations outweighs the long-term enforcement of non-proliferation perspectives and principles. And so Congress is the counter to that. It has been in the past and hopefully can be in the future. So for HR 1280, I think the idea that Congress should try to set stiffer standards and then force affirmative votes on agreements that don't meet those standards is a basically sound idea. It's just good government. Now there are some details in the existing version of 1280 that I think are a little bit outdated. I mean, I think there's been a little bit of a time warp in that non-proliferation has not gotten a lot of attention in the last 2 decades in the Congress, and so there's a bit of a failure, I think, to grasp the nature of the nuclear industry today, the truly integrated multinational nature of it, where even the Russians are approaching countries in alliance with providers in other countries like Siemens or Rolls-Royce in Britain or Siemens in Germany. So you have almost all nuclear services provided by consortia and multinational corporations today. So it makes it even more difficult to try to treat this issue as a matter of merely firming up your national policy, because that's not going to do it. We need a much more open-minded, collaborative, multinational approach to controlling the nuclear fuel cycle in the future. And that approach will be critical to avoiding future Irans, because, of course, Iran, despite all the venom that's spilled, Iran is far from unique. There are a number of countries that we don't often think about that are in Iran's category. Japan is in Iran's category, a non-weapon state under the NPT with fuel cycle capabilities. Brazil, Argentina, there will be more. North and South Korea is knocking on the door. Can we really manage all these demands, as it were, for fuel cycle technology, for enjoying the full fruits of the nuclear fuel cycle, by threatening endless sanctions backed up by military threats? I don't see it. There has to be a better way. And we've done, at NRDC, we've done collaborative research to try to figure out how would you do this? And the way we've come up with this is that you need to think of the fuel cycle as, and it is already, a very collaborative effort. The United States derives the vast bulk of its uranium and enrichment services from abroad. So we are actually living the example that we are trying to persuade the Iranians of. We're not being hypocritical when we go to the Iranians and say, you don't need enrichment, because we don't rely on a domestic state-owned enrichment capacity. We haven't for about 20 years. And, that we've gotten half of our separative work units from the Russians. And we get most of our uranium from countries that we're not even friendly with, like Kazakhstan. So, or we have, serious human rights concerns. Uzbekistan is another source of uranium supply. Niger. The international uranium market works well, and so we have to think about this as a more collaborative enterprise. That's sort of, if I was to adjust one important aspect of HR 1280, I would say the congressional involvement piece is very important, and I strongly support it. And by the way, I'm speaking as an individual, not on behalf of NRDC, because my institution has not taken a position on HR 1280. But speaking as an analyst, I think getting the Congress involved and having these debates and setting some standards are important. But we have to recognize that we are no longer an important supplier. As a nation state, per se, the United States is not an important supplier in the global market anymore. We're not an important supplier of uranium, we're not an important supplier of SWUs, and we're not really that important supplier of nuclear technology anymore. So we have to take that into account. Thank you.
I should note that my connection with NRDC is through Tom Cochran, who worked with me when I was at the Heritage Foundation, and with Mr. Vickery, which is an odd alliance. We defeated a program called the Clinch River Breeder Reactor together. And at that time, Heritage was 100% working on that, on the correct side, I would argue. And that is the same side NRDC was. In any case, the next speaker is someone I've had the privilege of working on a project which I call Our Lost Cause. India. We at least set standards. I think a lot of other things didn't work out so well. But in any case, the Arms Control Association has been active in the field, working on non-proliferation issues. So I couldn't think of anyone more appropriate than the head of the organization to have some words. Daryl.
I'm going to stand up here so that these folks over here can see me. Thank you very much for organizing this diverse set of people today, Henry. I'm going to join with my colleagues in suggesting that it is time to update the criteria for U.S. nuclear trade with our future civil nuclear cooperation agreements. But let me just go back to a couple fundamental points that I think are important to get on the table. Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty gives non-nuclear weapon states the right to pursue the peaceful nuclear use of nuclear energy in conformance with their safeguards obligations. It does not say anything about enrichment or reprocessing. Many states believe that Article 4 gives them the right to pursue enrichment and reprocessing. The treaty also, under Article 1, obligates all states not to in any way directly or indirectly contribute to a nuclear weapons program of another state. The United States is one of the enrichment and reprocessing technology possessors, is therefore not under an obligation to transfer that technology. And we have to be especially careful that in our civil nuclear cooperation agreements, we do not transfer technology that is used for nuclear weapons purposes now or in the future. So for good reason, the United States and other technology suppliers, particularly those in the nuclear suppliers group, have worked to deny the transfer of sensitive nuclear technologies to states that do not already possess them, and even to some states that already do. And the U.S. has done so under the terms of the Atomic Energy Act and the amendments from 1978. And I would also note, it hasn't been mentioned here, there is a new and important nuclear suppliers group rule adopted in June 2011 that calls upon NSG countries to bar the transfer of enrichment and reprocessing technology to states that don't have comprehensive safeguards, that have not joined the NPT, that do not have the additional protocol in force, or to states in proliferation-sensitive regions. So this is the basis upon which the administration is pursuing its policy on civil nuclear cooperation agreements. Tomorrow they're going to be rolling out a revised version of the policy. From my understanding, the policy will continue to encourage higher standards in U.S. nuclear cooperation partner countries, but will not require that every U.S. civil nuclear cooperation agreement is exactly the same. Now that bothers some members of Congress. We heard that today. We heard that over on the Senate side. Senator Corker has written a letter complaining that the Obama administration's policy is inconsistent because it does not require that all states forswear enrichment and reprocessing. I think it's important to keep in mind that requiring that states forswear what they consider to be a right under Article 4 of the NPT is not practical in every case. But we can set up a situation in which states that do meet that and other higher non-proliferation standards are incentivized by having a fast-track process for the evaluation of new or renegotiated nuclear cooperation agreements. So if Congress wants a greater degree of consistency in higher non-proliferation standards, it needs to act to strengthen the administration's leverage in its negotiations with the several different countries who we're engaged in and will be engaged in negotiations with on new and additional agreements. So another key point, we've heard about the so-called gold standard, which to me is something of a, doesn't quite make sense because we're talking about plutonium and uranium, which are not gold, but anyway, that's what it's called. They're not colored gold, they're different colors. HR 1280 that was introduced by Sherman, Berman, Ros-Lehtinen back in 2011 would not require that states adopt the so-called gold standards. Instead, the bill would add several new requirements several new requirements that are already in Section 123A of the Atomic Energy Act that, if met, would fast-track that country's nuclear cooperation agreement for approval. And if they don't, it would require an affirmative vote by Congress. Some of the other important additional provisions in 1280, in addition to a pledge not to acquire enrichment or processing capabilities or facilities, is the application of the Iaea additional protocol. And we've got to remember that dozens of states have not yet approved the additional protocol, including Algeria, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is one of the countries with which we're going to be negotiating potentially a new nuclear cooperation agreement. In addition, we would also suggest that the bill could be strengthened further in several different ways. One, by clarifying that the recipient state must allow for the application of its comprehensive safeguards agreement under the terms of the most up-to-date Iaea revisions. Iran has just essentially agreed to do this through the terms of the first phase agreement from November 24th. Another one, requiring the termination of U.S. nuclear cooperation in the event that the recipient state conducts a nuclear test explosion. This was an idea that was built into the 123 for India, though not explicit. If the state is found to be in violation of its Iaea safeguards obligations or acquires enrichment and reprocessing equipment from sources other than the United States. Those would be grounds for terminating the U.S. nuclear cooperation agreement with that country. So a modified version of 1280, I think, is a reasonable place to start. It's a good foundation. It is, as Chris said, it is not by any means perfect. Some aspects are out of date. And it's going to be very important for the Congress, Republicans in particular, to avoid making this a political football, especially in the context of the debate about Iran. This is something that, this is a serious non-proliferation and national security matter that will have implications for many, many years to come. The decisions and the motivations should not be governed by what's happening right now, but with a view towards what's going to be happening over the next several years. One final point on whether this can prevent future Irans. If this legislation were passed many years ago, could this have prevented the situation in Iran today? Probably not, because we are not engaged with today, nor will we likely be engaged in civil nuclear cooperation with Iran. And furthermore, Iran's enrichment program was built up through the black market, through the transfer of enrichment technology from our ally Pakistan and AQCON's black market network. Looking forward, I'll have to say I disagree. As Henry said, people disagree about the interim agreement that was reached on November 24th. I think one of the things we need to remember as we look ahead to that debate is we need to recognize that it's in all of our interests to reduce Iran's capacity to make fissile materials for weapons. It has that capacity already. It's had it since about 2007. It's in our interest to reduce the amount of time it would take to detect noncompliance with an agreement to limit its program. And it's in our interest to find ways to develop a sustainable framework, because we're not just going to be dealing with an Iranian enrichment program over the next 1 to 2 years, but over the long term. And for that reason, the illusion that we can persuade Iran to permanently suspend its enrichment program, I think, is false, and we need to be realistic about what we can accomplish under the current difficult circumstances. Thanks.
Okay. I told you I wouldn't succeed, but we have another speaker. Kingston Reif, heads up the Center for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Please come on board.
Well, thank you very much, Henry, for assembling all of us this afternoon. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief so we have some time for questions and discussion. The November 24th 24th First Step Agreement between the P5+1 and Iran has brought renewed attention to the question of how to strengthen the rules for nuclear nonproliferation and increase congressional oversight and authority over 123 agreements that don't meet higher nonproliferation standards. While the members of Congress and expert panel that Henry has assembled today disagree about the merits of the First Step Iran Agreement, and I suspect what a good final stage agreement would look like, I think we can all agree that we certainly don't want to go through future Iran-like nuclear impasses, and that we don't want additional states to develop indigenous enrichment and reprocessing capabilities, whether those states are allies and partners or adversaries. So an important question is, how can we prevent the spread of nuclear fuel-making technologies? What steps can Congress take to strengthen the nonproliferation rules? I believe that the so-called gold standard is a useful addition to the global nonproliferation regime and complements other U.S. efforts to prevent the spread of enrichment and reprocessing. That the United Arab Emirates and Taiwan have recently agreed to forgo enrichment and reprocessing capabilities in the context of their nuclear cooperation agreements with the United States is a very good thing from a nonproliferation perspective. However, while the United States should seek the inclusion of a legally binding no ENR commitment in new agreements and agreements up for renewal with countries that do not already have enrichment and reprocessing capabilities, the gold standard will not be possible to achieve in every 123 agreement. In order to both strengthen the hand of the executive branch in negotiating nuclear cooperation agreements with the highest nonproliferation standards, and provide the recipients of nuclear cooperation with incentives to forgo enrichment and reprocessing, Congress should revise and update the nonproliferation conditions and the U.S. Atomic Energy Act. H.R. 1280, many of the details of which have already been described here today, was an important step in the right direction in terms of strengthening U.S. law. The bill would not prevent other countries from forever pursuing enrichment and reprocessing, but in a departure from current practice, require that Congress approve agreements with countries that have not ratified the additional protocol and do not contain a no ENR pledge. During the last Congress, the Obama administration and the nuclear industry lined up in opposition to H.R. 1280. One common argument in opposition to the legislation is that by requiring more stringent standards, it would deny NPT members their rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But asking that states forgo ENR is not about denying rights. It is about asking countries not to exercise rights in the context of a bilateral cooperation agreement with the United States. In any event, as I mentioned, under H.R. 1280, Congress could still pass agreements without a no ENR pledge. Such agreements would simply require a higher bar for approval than those containing such a pledge. Another argument made against H.R. 1280 is that by requiring tougher standards, other countries will not agree to nuclear cooperation with the United States and instead turn to other suppliers for nuclear trade. Not only would this hurt the U.S. nuclear industry, critics argue, it would also weaken America's ability to influence global nonproliferation behavior via physical protection standards, consent rights, and more. Regarding the nuclear industry, it's an open question whether the status quo will lead to increased business for the industry relative to an approach that insists on tougher nonproliferation standards. Similar arguments were made at the time Congress was considering the amendments to the Atomic Energy Act via the 1978 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, and they were found to be wanting at the time by GAO and others. Regarding the alleged reduction in U.S. nonproliferation influence, this argument was also made in 1978. However, the modifications to existing law proposed as part of H.R. 1280 are far less stringent than those enacted in 1978, and these amendments did not inhibit the United States from successfully renegotiating most of the existing 123 agreements at that time. So I think I'll stop there. I wanted to say a few words about how Iran figures into this equation, but in the interest of time and discussion, I'll stop there.
Our last speaker comes from the Foreign Policy Initiative, which is, I guess the former president now is working for Senator Rubio as a foreign policy, yes. So maybe it'll be a slightly different perspective. Bobby Zarate is the head of their research policy. He's in charge of their policy research. How am I doing?
Good.
Good, okay.
I'm also an alumnus of NPEC, and so anything that I say that's objectionable, you can blame on me, and anything that you like, you can blame on Henry. But, and I'll just say it's good to be back on the Hill. Good to see friends out there who are still on the Hill and still part of the problem. I missed the Hill too. A couple points here, and I'll keep it mostly brief because I think the most fruitful part of this discussion will be the interaction that we all have. But a couple points. One, I think that what you've heard a strong bipartisan consensus here today that there's a strong need for Congress to get involved, and that it is part of this process in debating both U.S. nuclear non-proliferation policy and also the future of the U.S.'s role in global nuclear commerce. And that point, I think there is a strong argument to build upon. My second point is to build on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978. I would echo what Kingston said, that a lot of the arguments we hear today with people who object to any further strengthening of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act and the Atomic Energy Act, I've gone through the legislative history. I did that years ago when I first started on the Hill under Don McDonald over there. I originally worked for a D and then switched to an R. But not for any partisan reasons, just because it was the best job I could find.
Best boss you can find.
Sorry?
Best boss you can find.
Best boss I can find. Yeah, he's a good boss too. And I'll allude to that in a second. Whether I was working with Don or working with Congressman Fortenberry, there was always a strong bipartisan effort to try to improve the rules. And so I want to echo everything that people said here. There is a strong bipartisan desire. There are leaders out there. They just need the forum, but they're trying to find a way to lead it to improve the rules. And just on a related note too, I helped Don back in the day, and also as a staffer under Fortenberry, was part of the discussion on HR 1280. My boss at the time, Fortenberry, co-sponsored it. Congressman Fortenberry also introduced the bill HR 3774 in the 111th Congress. And it sought to get the United States, the executive branch, to implement Title V of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it basically encourages, requires the president to look at every country that we might be doing nuclear trade with to also assess their full scope energy needs and to sort of make economically driven determinations as to what makes most sense for them. Now, how do you do this? Henry actually had sponsored, had worked with folks at Dahlberg Global Development Advisory Group who actually did such a study, which has a very good analytical framework, and it's straightforward. Look at the total potential capacity that a country might need in terms of energy consumption. Look at the relative costs. Assess also, third point, the energy security and location of sources for energy, and then assess environmental issues. You use that framework, and you find often that, at the end of the day, a lot of energy is about what's the cheapest way to boil water. And, the cheapest way to boil water, frankly, is often not nuclear, especially if you're looking for things less than baseline. And so this is a point. I'm tearing a page out of Henry's book here, but the invisible hand sometimes can be helpful. Adam Smith's invisible hand can be very helpful in helping us to figure out what is actually most sensible and justifiable and defensible for a country's energy choices. And I think I'll close with that because I think it's worth noting that whatever the merits and demerits of the Geneva Plan, Joint Plan of Action, one of its phrases that it talks about is trying to help, trying to determine a final end state with Iran that has a nuclear program consistent with its practical needs. Well, I would submit to you today that efforts such as a modified, updated version of HR 1280, as well as an effort to actually enforce laws that are on the books, such as Title V of the Non-Proliferation Act of 1978, can help us to figure out, not just in Iran, but in future countries, what among their many energy choices, if you just put aside politics, prestige, etc., what is actually economically consistent with their practical needs. And just the last point, I think I'll sort of start where we began here on this panel. I get that we have a very different sort of structure in terms of global nuclear commerce today. It's much more integrated. But that's not an excuse to forfeit leadership. Rather, it urges and demands leadership. And not just leadership from behind, not just leadership from within the pack, but leadership from straight ahead. Because frankly, at the end of the day, if a country like the United States hadn't pushed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978, it would not have happened. And I know we have good friends here who will probably disagree on the merits of this issue, and I look forward to that debate, and let's have it, and then let's try to find a way to move forward. Thank you.
Okay. There we go. This is the model. You raise your hand, you get recognized, and you get to ask a question.
My name is Rod Adams. I write for Atomic Insights. And the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978 was passed at a time when the U.S. had about 75 to 80% of the world's market in nuclear trade. And as Mr. Chris Paine has pointed out, we now have almost nothing. We don't have a domestically owned nuclear power plant designer other than B&W. Every other nuclear power plant designer in the U.S. is a foreign-owned country. Now, it seems to me like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act and the GAO's analysis ignored the commercial aspects of what that added restrictions on trade would do.
Okay.
Why do you think we should make it harder for us to do business?
Okay, before let me take this on. I have a modest background, but I do remember being a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the late 80s and early 90s. I can assure you, if we had not passed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 78, we wouldn't have what's called the 110 list. And the 110 list is very interesting. There's also another list of dual-use items. We were the only country to regulate these items, these dual-use items. No one else did. By the way, by the time the 90s came around, we were where you were talking about. I mean, we did not sell reactors by then in a big way. Just didn't. It was all gone. Interesting thing happened. Because we took a leadership position, despite the economic penalty that was perceived by industry, rightly or wrongly, I'm not going to get into that, we were able to persuade everyone else in the nuclear suppliers group, including some of the worst actors, to control those items the way we did. Now, it could very well be it's wild, wild west. In which case, as I said on the commission I served on WMD, dig deep, run fast. You're in trouble. It's all over. If not, let me make a suggestion. Because companies are more integrated with foreign owners, we actually have opportunities, if industry should choose to come along, to have more leverage than we had back in the 80s. The market in the United States still matters. Certainly for fuel, people want in still. Talk to Urenco. Areva, before they went broke, wanted in. The Russians still are sort of interested. I think we underestimate what's possible when we don't try. If you do, you will find leverage along the way in new ways that you did not even have before. Lack of imagination will generate despair. Buck up. Anyone else?
I'll just add very quickly to that. I think I disagree. If I understood the premise of your question, which is basically the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act of 1978 led to the demise of, or dissolution of the U.S. nuclear industry. I disagree. I disagree.
Was part of it.
You had your chance. I get you. Okay, so it helped. But as for, even if you were to determine the extent to which it is the cause, as opposed to the fact that, for example, Congressman Sherman spoke about the liability issues. Even if we wanted to export to a lot of the countries with whom we have civil nuclear cooperative agreements, we don't have the necessary nuclear civil liability structures set in place. So, I take your point. It's a fair point that we need to ask to what extent does any future decisions affect. But I guess this sort of monocausal explanation, or I guess you've relaxed it. It's not monocausal, but you claim it's largely contributed to it. I would disagree that largely contributed. I think part of the problem too has to do with just nuclear insurance. The fact that we can't sell, we don't have state-owned corporations. We don't have state-owned corporations that export this stuff. And therefore, they have to operate under completely different assumptions about liability. If you have anything to add.
Real quick.
Okay.
Real quick. I mean, one thing just to keep in mind is that the standards that are outlined in 1280, the higher standards, are the same higher standards that Dick Stratford is trying to negotiate in the 9 to 10 nuclear cooperation agreements he's now out there trying to work out. So, I mean, what this would do is it would strengthen his hand. It would create a common standard for all. So, the premise of your question is that these will make it harder. This bill will make it harder to negotiate those agreements. I don't necessarily think that's the case, in part because this is what he's already trying to build into many of these agreements, but it's not being successful about in some respects, and that has consequences for how those agreements are going to be evaluated back here in Congress.
Ted?
Hi, Ted Jones, Nuclear Energy Institute. Just wanted to point out to Daryl's point about Dick Stratford. The State Department issued a statement about H.R. 1280 opposing it for, among other reasons, that it would prevent them from concluding agreements. Exactly the opposite thing. And in fact, since this issue has been simmering for the last few years, we haven't concluded any new negotiations for agreements. And this is one of the big reasons why, because countries have projected they won't consider it. Even close allies like Jordan won't consider it. Vietnam won't consider it. And they don't have to, because they have other suppliers. And in fact, Vietnam is procured, tied up in supply arrangements with Russia and Japan. And as Fred McGoldrick has analyzed in a very thorough analysis of trade controls, when our supply to the global markets is decreasing, it reduces not just U.S. influence on all these growing and some new markets, but it also lowers actual standards for nuclear safety, security, and non-proliferation, because right now our standards are higher than those of Russia.
Thank God for that. By the way, let us not concede to the IAEA our standards, which need to even be higher, I would argue, than they are. But surely we shouldn't go down to the lower standards, you wouldn't argue. I think this catches the essence of the debate between you and I. Half full, half empty. Should we have higher standards or not? By the way, point of correction, Taiwan surely is another state that has agreed to continue. No, let me finish. We are in a discussion with the Koreans, some of whom are here right now, with that very standard in mind. I would not be running those negotiations down, sir.
Yeah, can I respond to the Taiwan point?
You may.
Taiwan isn't going to be the second country to accept the so-called gold standard after UAE. It was the first.
Okay.
It had a bilateral understanding with the United States.
How shall I put it?
1979.
They renewed.
And I think that Taiwan, which, like no other country, is dependent on U.S. security guarantees to accede to a U.S. request in a negotiation, just shows that it's really not the model for other countries. And Vietnam is the proof. We don't have to wonder what happened. Maybe 3 years ago we could wonder what Vietnam would do. But we actually have an experience with it now.
Yeah, you led, I believe NEI was involved in the delegation that went there. So how shall I put it? Perhaps a different delegation, different results. Also, I'll take renewal and another number any day over giving up. And I think that's where we're headed, if I understand your argument. I wouldn't go there.
Henry, I
just
want this, of course, is a very area that we've been working on very assiduously for several years now. And there's got to be a third way. I mean, are you willing? There's truth to both sides of this argument. That if you push the agreement in principle too far, you're going to get a rejection based on a juridical principle, not on any real intent by that country to proceed to enrichment and reprocessing on any realistic time frame. So the question then becomes, and that's why each one of these agreements has to be considered, I think, affirmatively on their merits, because there may be workarounds for those countries. For example, South Korea, the workaround may be South Korean participation in equity participation in a multilateral enrichment facility in East Asia. And they get their fuel security. That's one workaround. Similarly, to take on the bear in the room. I mean, what happens after the expiration of the Russian supply contract in 10 years to Bushehr? You know, that's when that will be crunch time in the Iranian agreement, because they don't need the fuel for 10 years. So there's, you know, we can build in at least a 10-year period in which the production of LEU is very constrained in Iran. And without much difficulty, the Iranians will accept that. The question then becomes, do they lose their having reinstated themselves in the good graces of the international community with 10 years of good behavior? Do they then lose their rights to pursue enrichment? No, there's got to be another path. An international partner, perhaps, an equity stake by the French or the Russians in a plant if there's, for example, regional demand in the Middle East that justifies that. There are ways to do this, to me, that kind of can square the circle that we're now in, and I think we have to think outside the box now, because we are facing a different economic reality.
Florence?
Florence Lowry, Global America Business Institute. Just to follow up on Chris Paine's question, I'll answer. Now that you mentioned South Korea and its multilateral approach to enrichment in a region, what would be your ideal picture of a South Korean's case? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, there have been several groups in the region that have been looking at this over a number of years. For example, Australia reserves the right, because it's the second largest producer of uranium in the world, to add value to its product. And in fact, it is the author, it is the inventor of the Silex process that's now been developed by GE and Hitachi. So, and there are real questions. For example, the process for uranium enrichment is licensed by GE and Hitachi, but all the other applications are still open. That process can be used to enrich many different kinds of materials. And so the technology may get out, for example, for silicon enrichment. So I think for example, a plant looking to the future, 10 or 15 years from now, and a multilateral enrichment facility in Australia makes a lot of sense. Now, the Australians might have to change their policy, but a number of countries in the region, if they wanted fuel security, could buy into that plant. Vietnam, for example, would be a good way to head off any long-term demand in Vietnam for enrichment. Because this model is now well established, and countries have for decades accepted getting their fuel, including the United States, from these multilateral facilities. So I think we need not be hopeless about this, neither about the non-proliferation implications or the commercial implications. I think they can be reconciled.
I might add, it could even not be multilateral. I mean, the point is who you're comfortable with. If you can get it, you save money, and you're comfortable. Whether it's multilateral or not may not even be the issue.
Just to elaborate on this one last point, you know, we've got to be able to take yes for an answer where Iran is concerned. We've got to be able to say they have come back to the international community. You know, the interesting thing, the Iranians were attacked by Iraq with chemical weapons with active U.S. assistance. There were Defense Intelligence Agency personnel on the ground with ground stations helping Saddam target those attacks. That will someday, I think, ultimately come out into the open. But I know that to be the case from my time ago. So the question is, and they did not retaliate with chemical weapons. So this incredible pessimism about that the Iranians are engaged in this implacable drive for nuclear weapons, I don't think that's what's really going on. And we have to give them a way down from the limb that they've climbed out on, a graceful way out. And if we're intelligent about it, we can, and we can avoid a really horrific confrontation in that region.
It might be easier to do it with South Korea first. Okay.
Yes. I'm John Lyman, Director of Energy and Environment Program at the Atlantic Council, and I really appreciate sitting on this meeting, which is sort of a precursor and a warm-up as well to a session that we're having tomorrow, which includes Poneman, Susan Eisenhower, and a number of others on exactly the same issue, non-proliferation, non-reprocessing, etc. And I did want to announce that to this group because if any of you want to attend it, it's at 2:45, 2:30 tomorrow at the Atlantic Council, and we'll leave outside the person to contact. That's Catherine Sparks, asparks@atlanticcouncil.org. And if you want to attend, please write her, and we've got a big group already, but it's absolutely on the same subject you're talking now. It allows for further discussion of these issues, which I think is going to require a number of multiple dialogues.
Do you have a question?
It's
That's
going to take
okay.
a lot more dialogues.
Okay, all right. Sir.
Yeah, you want to come?
You want to come. By the way, you should have more food.
Yeah, my name is Dean Russ.
We have food.
We have food. Okay, there's food.
We have food.
Okay, there you go. Food. There's food. All right.
My name is Dean Russ. I'm retired from the State Department. Before that, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. I'm probably older than
Maybe you should stand up because...
my name is Dean Russ. I'm retired from the State Department and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Before that, I was involved a lot with my colleague Fred McGoldrick in 123 negotiations over the years. Did some of the first nuclear proliferation assessment statements that were required by the NPEC.
All right. Despite that, we are curious what you think.
Despite that, the big issue I have here, I think it makes a lot of sense for Congress to want to look at ways that it can increase its oversight over 123. That makes a lot of sense. But then from there on, and I've looked at some of the things that are in 1280, yeah, I could actually work with some of those, I think. If I was still in the executive branch and was negotiating with the Hill on an acceptable arrangement with 1280, I could work with some of that stuff. But the gold standard gives me real heartburn. And the reason is that you're asking countries, as somebody already said, that probably have no intention of doing this anyway, to give up, with all due respect to Kingston, a right that is enshrined in the NPT. I will say that it's a right that existed before the NPT, but the NPT just enshrines it. And you're asking them to do that because Iran built a clandestine enrichment plant.
Okay, there's a question. Please get to a question.
Well, the issue is that what possible threat is there out there today that you can project over the next 20 years that requires Vietnam to give up the legal right to do this over the next 30 years?
Okay.
I mean, where's it coming from? I mean, Brad Sherman himself said that 123 will not stop Iran.
Okay. There's a question here, finally. The question is, once you get beyond Iran, who do we have to worry about in the next 20 years?
Well, what good does 123 do?
Okay.
That's the issue.
Why don't we answer the question?
Let me try to answer your question. I mean, I was trying to make the point clearly that we cannot require a state to give up what they think of as an option. This is what the word right, okay? It's their sovereign right to keep this option open. But we can say to them, if you don't agree to do that, okay, we're going to evaluate this 123 agreement a little differently. And that means that the Congress is going to have to take an affirmative vote and look at your 123 agreement. It may still approve it. It probably will. But that's the way we're going to do business, rather than having, an arbitrary number of days that Congress has to deny the 123, which effectively means in this Congress, which can't do anything in 30 to 60 days, that the agreement's going to go through. So that's the difference, okay? And I think that's a very common sense thing. And for those who think that this is going to end all U.S. nuclear commerce, U.S. nuclear commerce may not continue in the future for various other reasons, but this is not going to be the reason. And furthermore, I mean, I also pointed out that the Nuclear Suppliers Group just passed a policy that requires all of the ENR technology suppliers to deny the transfer, essentially, to any state that does not already have this technology. Right, so this is part of the global norm. This would help strengthen it with respect to our dealings with these countries. I think that's pretty reasonable. That's a reasonable update to amendments that were passed over 30 years ago by the Congress.
Okay. By the way, Saudi Arabia. Okay. Well, we will talk more.
Okay.
But you got your answers. You got two of them.
That's
Please stand up.
All right. Hi, Aubrey Beagley from the American Nuclear Society. Just a couple things. I guess the nuclear industry has no interest in promoting enrichment and reprocessing in other countries. The U.S., ANS has members in this business, and it doesn't make sense to have additional competition. So we share the objective of the gold standard, especially, we're happy when countries like UAE and Taiwan are willing to embrace this. But we think an even more powerful tool of the U.S. non-proliferation policy would be the active involvement of U.S. nuclear industry in the civil nuclear energy development internationally. And this is just because, as Ted said, we have the highest non-proliferation standards.
In the form of a question, please.
So in the form of a question,
Thank you.
I would, like to hear your opinion of why you would think the gold standard in 123 agreements would not set back the U.S. because it would effectively turn over the foreign markets to other, like Russia, China, people who are less committed to non-proliferation norms.
It may well be that the market already, if we listen carefully to industry, half the time they're saying it's already there. The other half is we're going to make $150 billion in this market or that market. It's a little schizophrenic. That's point one. I think the integration of the market suggests if you have a standard, you will find out what you can do. What is being discussed is called democracy. It's called a vote. It's not saying you can't do something.
Right. It's a process.
And apparently we've gotten into the habit over the last, since '54 when Congress gave up this power, because they had it before. Trade agreements required a vote. But they did this for Eisenhower and a propaganda war against the Soviets selling very small, safe reactors. They were research reactors. We're not talking about that anymore. So I think framing this as a prevention or, a prohibition gets it wrong. The kinds of innovation that, you're interested in or other countries are interested in will be driven by a standard that says we should try to do X. How you do that may vary. This does not dictate. It suggests where you need to be shooting. Now, if you don't have the standard, you then get into old saws. My favorite, most abusive thing to say, which I got from Tom Cochrane, by the way, the British, in the old days, when the trade was about something truly obnoxious, not nuclear reactors, which are not truly obnoxious, they said, well, we have to be in the slave trade to control it. There was only one problem. The British never did. And that's the reason, in the end, that interest group lost out. They did not have a standard. So what you need to do to build this argument about standards and being in the business is show us where industry has, in fact, pulled ranks and said, we're in this business, and now we're going to enforce some standard because we have the influence. That's not a history that's been very, very available yet.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Henry said earlier, that because of the integration of the global market, I see merit on both sides of this debate. There is, I think now, just intuitively, there would be a commercial impact if countries, are confronting the standard, they don't want to comply with it, then they may wind up signing long-term contracts with some other country that doesn't require it. So that suggests not to dilute the standard, but to make it flexible so that the Congress gets to vote on whether the exception is merited or not. But also for active U.S. diplomacy, because as Henry said, there are a lot of companies knocking on the door to get into the U.S. market. We are a big nuclear market with almost 100 reactors. And who knows, nuclear might grow here. It doesn't look very good at the moment, but it might. And future suppliers are trying to get in here, the Russians and the South Koreans, for example. South Korea is going to seek licensing of its APR 1400 design. So I think, and then when you think about big projects like international nuclear waste storage, which the Russians are interested in, the U.S. has enormous leverage there, since so much of the spent fuel in the world is under U.S. consent rights. It couldn't go to Russia unless we said it could go. So there's an enormous $40 billion, $50 billion project there that could bring the Russians around to our non-proliferation standards if they were serious about doing this international nuclear waste storage. So that there's a lot to do. We do not lack for paths forward on this.
Okay. Last question. I'm hoping for the best here.
Retired palm thrower. I think that we're running into a problem of the nature of U.S. leadership. In that,
You're not talking about your former boss again, are you?
which one? We've been talking today largely about maintaining Congress's proper role and enforcing standards. What we have not done, despite Chris's encouragement, is to say what else the United States could do to make other countries want to come around to our approach.
Right.
And so I'm going to throw that back at the panel.
Fair enough.
What are the positive things that the United States should be doing? For example, shouldn't we be upping the budget of the IAEA so that if there are going to be daily inspections here and there, they would have the money and the material to do it? Secondly, should the United States bite the bullet in terms of subsidizing fuel supplies or full-scope fuel takebacks in order to make the idea of doing without ENR more palatable to other countries? And what role should the United States have in the more complex relationships that Chris is talking about on an international level?
By the way, the commission that I served on, and every other commission that's ever been created, always talks about these things. What's very important before you fund things like the IAEA, which you should, I encourage everyone to send extra nickels, okay? I've given at the office, I think you should too. But before you do, it'd be nice to have some standards for them. And the ones they have, you might ask them to uphold. And they're having a heck of a time. This is all done internally in sort of studies that aren't released to the public. Are we living up to our own standards? Let me just tell you, the answer is, well, no. It might be useful if we looked into that, if we were curious. Then, when we spend money, we might know whether we're failing or succeeding, number one. Number two...
The IAEA is perfectly open. Whenever a head of safeguards retires, then he starts telling people what the problems are.
Actually, given the pension program, even then there are problems. Why don't we go through the panel?
Yeah, I mean, we have proposed that the financing of the IAEA is a scandal. It's scandalous that the United States constantly, has this hortatory policy of strengthening non-proliferation controls, and yet we can't manage to increase the budget of the IAEA. And it's about $450 million to cover the entire globe. I mean, it's just and all the new tasks that the agency is taking on. It's ridiculous. So we've proposed that the IAEA be funded by a surcharge on separated work units or kilograms of U308 product, and just the way the Department of Energy in this country has collected for decades a nuclear waste fee. I think on every kilowatt of electricity
maybe with some services for
Yeah,
them.
and didn't deliver anything. At least the IAEA is delivering and would deliver, and everything the IAEA does is a necessary cost of the nuclear industry operating globally on a safe basis. So it should be self-financing. The industry should largely finance the operations of the IAEA. And if you collected this charge on a global basis, it would amount to a very small amount, a small surcharge on separate work units or U308 product, and on a kilogram basis, for example. And so it would disappear into the cost of nuclear electricity, because those costs, fuel costs, are a very small percentage of the total amortized cost of nuclear electricity. It's mainly the amortized capital cost and of the operations and maintenance cost. So there's we need to up the budget. We need to treble it at least. It should be a $1.5 to $2 billion agency, not a $450 million agency, given what it has to do. And it's a very easy way to do it. And the nuclear industry should step up and propose that.
Very brief closing word. As was mentioned, tomorrow, Energy and State Department officials are going to be talking about their revised policy for the negotiation of these future nuclear cooperation agreements. They're going to be likely arguing that we have the highest standards. We are doing our best to negotiate the best agreements, and we're doing a great job. My basic argument, and many of these people are colleagues and people we work with on a number of issues, and I agree with them on many things, but on this issue I think they can do better, and I think that they need to be creative in working with Congress to improve 1280, which is not a perfect vehicle, to look for ways to update amendments to the Atomic Energy Act that were passed a long time ago. So I'm a little concerned that in this partisan climate this can't be done well because Congress is broken, because the relationship between the executive branch and Congress is not good. But for a number of the reasons that people have raised here, we've got long-term future issues to look at, and there are ways in which industry, Congress, and the administration need to work together to improve what we have, particularly with respect to the process that currently exists for reviewing these agreements. And I think what we've all talked about here today is quite reasonable, straightforward. It's consistent with the 21st century non-proliferation standards that we and many other countries, including our allies and our erstwhile allies, are trying to aspire to.
Kingston? I just wanted to, in conclusion, echo the points that Chris was making about steps we can take toward multinationalization. I mean, I think ultimately that is the real gold standard and the direction that we want to be going. In terms of the question of U.S. leverage, I just wanted to add one final point. While I don't think this is necessarily decisive, I don't think we should underestimate the political seal of approval and recognition associated with a 1-2-3 agreement with the United States. As I said, I don't think that's necessarily decisive, but countries care about that. They care about the recognition as a technological leader associated with a U.S. stamp of approval 1-2-3 agreement. So that is leverage that the United States has and can continue to act on as a leader.
And just to add to that, I'll echo what Kingston said, that countries do want U.S. 1-2-3 agreements because they are meaningful, as signifying that this cooperating state is a good actor. Two, in terms of the NPT Article 4, I didn't opine on this earlier, but I'm glad to see President Obama, as well as Secretary of State Kerry, and others, Wendy Sherman, talk about how the NPT didn't have an inherent, per se, right to enrich. I think any fair reading of the treaty, the idea that it gives you the right to life, liberty, illiberty, and the pursuit of nuclear weapons making capability on short notice is just ultimately very self-destructive reading. And then just last, that gentleman's question here about sort of why are we wringing our hands about this? I mean, I think the Middle East is an obvious reason. In Asia, we have alliance structures which have helped to create disincentives for states to perhaps make moves more towards weapons. The security architecture in the Middle East is not there. And perhaps in the short term, we can sort of rest easy, but looking down the long term, and there are a lot of uncertainties looking forward. I would say that if you can sort of lock in a better architecture in which states refrain from getting rapid nuclear weapons making capabilities, that's probably a better way to control a sort of post-Iran race for nuclear weapons making capability rather than having to focus a lot of military assets. But we should be prepared to do both.
Well, I think the herd has thinned. I'd like to think you're all best of breed for having hung in there. One last comment. There are people in the industry who share their views with me who are very concerned not about exports of U.S. reactors, which they think are improbable, but the ability to share technology and intangible design information that is in Korean, Japanese products. For them, the 123 is important to allow them to export, and for our industry to be able at least to do the design and architect, engineer, and consultant work to support that. Now, if that isn't leverage and integration, I don't know what is. Again, study up, think bigger, please. I don't think we've joined this issue for the future as well as we need to. On that note, thank you very much.